Today, I want to talk about something very taboo in punk culture. I want to talk about something that everybody just sweeps under the rug. Everybody in punk rock, everybody in the underground DIY scene don't want to talk about this topic. It's a very stinky word. It has such a bad stigma to it. But today, I gotta talk about fashion. Yeah, that's right, fashion. Because it seems some people forget that the whole punk rock aesthetic was born out of a boutique in London, okay? This came from artists. This came from people that were designers, people that were cutting up clothes, changing the way that they looked as a show of rebellion to everybody around them. So yes, it was fashion. Yes, it was style, but it was still rooted in rebellion. It was still rooted in going against the system. It still very much was a very punk rock thing to be happening. And if it wasn't for this fashion boutique in London, punk rockers would still be wearing skinny jeans and leather jackets, and that's it. There was a little bit of a give and take when it comes to punk culture from America and England. Between the two, they were developing styles on rock and roll, they were developing styles of clothing, and then back and forth, ping-ponging across the Atlantic, they came up with what journalists would dub punk rock. Hey, how's it going? My name is Dan Frampton. Thank you for kicking back with me here today as we discuss punk fashion, all right? If this sounds like something that you want to listen to, you can hit that like button down there, throw a couple stacks of pancakes, that kind of thing. All right, with all that out of the way, let's talk about the early 70s, okay? Rock and roll. Now, this is not going to be like a comprehensive discussion. This isn't going to be a deep dive by any stretch of the imagination, okay? I just want to bring punk fashion to the table of discussion, okay? Because it is, like I said, a little bit of a taboo subject. But as rock and roll was developing into the early 70s, people were starting to experiment with their expressions a little bit, all right? There was this little group called the New York Dolls, and their manager, Malcolm McLaren, and he will be a regular figure in this story, decided we gotta push the envelope, all right? How's it about you tease your hair a little bit? How's it about you put on a little bit of makeup and go out there and gender bend a little bit? And rock and roll up until then was pretty buttoned down. But then you'd have the godfather of punk rock, Iggy Pop, out there in all of his brutal, wild energy without a shirt on, just rolling around, and people were just feasting on that magnetic energy. So through those forms of expression that were brought to the table with bands like the New York Dolls and artists like Iggy Pop, it would inspire people to be a little bit more aggressive and to be in tune with what they actually want. But all of this stuff here in the early 70s isn't really what we associate with punk rock when we think about it in our brains, okay? When we start to think of plaid pants, ripped shirts, leather jackets, vests, patches, pins, mohawks, safety pins, that kind of thing, we gotta thank Vivienne Westwood and her boutique in London called Sex. And after Malcolm McLaren was done with the New York Dolls, he was in that boutique with Vivienne Westwood, all right? And he had this idea, right? He was like, all right, there's this kind of like raw underground, aggressive rock and roll type thing that's really raging against the system right now. And your whole fashion thing that you're doing over here, Vivienne Westwood, is pretty cool. I think I could combine these two things and make a super project, a super art project. And that, my friends, is where the Sex Pistols were born. So wherever you land in this argument where you think punk rock was born, was it CBGB? Was it the Sex Boutique in London? It's kind of both, and they both wouldn't have existed without one another. With how rock and roll was developing and with how the whole monarchy just existed, it was a perfect amalgamation of things to happen for all of this culture to just be brought to the forefront. So yeah, people are expressing themselves through the music and through the way that they dance to that music, but also the way that they present themselves when they dance to that music at the shows where this music is played. It was a very big aspect of it. So much so that it started to feel like a uniform, that it started to feel like these people were conforming to a scene. They were conforming to the punk rock rock aesthetic, all right? They were going out, they were buying clothes and cutting them up and hoping that the people at the shows would think that they were cool. And it would be this kind of behavior that would inspire the people that were doing it authentically to change and reinvent themselves, and that has not changed even to this day. As soon as late adopters start making a thing look whack, people are going to want to try to move on from it because they don't want to be associated with this whack thing. So all of that edgy imagery, okay? These people were playing around with like iron crosses and swastikas and that type of thing just to ruffle feathers, okay? But as soon as people started to do it to kind of look cool rather than to go against the system and rise up and kind of like rebel and revolt and all that kind of stuff, it made the new punk rockers want to do something a little bit more constructive, okay? So they'd just be showing up in their clothes, all right? They'd have a pair of Nikes on, maybe a hoodie, but that in itself was a fashion statement. And they want to say it's not a fashion statement. They want to say that it's against the fashion, but no, that was a choice, okay? That was an aesthetic choice made deliberately for looks. And there's nothing wrong with that. We have to identify ourselves by era, by group, by class, however you want to do it, you know what I mean? You want to show the world what you're all about, and the easiest and most direct way to do it is through how you look. So as we move through the 80s, we kind of get that like anti-style youth crew kind of posy-core type stuff. So much so that they're like saying, hey, you guys were rising up and being shitheads back there when you guys were being punk rock. We want to build everything up. We want to unite. Y'all were drinking and doing heroin. Well, we're not doing any of that. We're all straight edge. So when the paradigm shifted in the 80s, the paradigm shifted. But of course, that's when punk rock kind of fell out of mainstream popularity and went back to where it belonged in the DIY underground of the world. No longer were we seeing Sex Pistols #1 top of the pops kind of thing. Now we had Henry Rollins rolling around without his shirt on, calling back to that animal magnetism of Iggy Pop. So you got the godfather of punk rock in Iggy Pop and the godfather of hardcore in Henry Rollins, very much the same side of two different coins. And as we move through the 80s, you know, hair metal is starting to take over the top of the pops. And in the underground, we got an amalgamation of all these things that kind of existed. It's like a melting pot of everything up until this point. People with mohawks, people with the skullets going on, but still kind of tucked away, you know what I mean? They might show up on Regis and Kathy Lee for a little shocking interview every now and then. There might be a big kind of thing in the press every now and then, but it wasn't really the cultural thing that it was in the 70s. And that would be until the 90s, when the Seattle grunge movement started to sweep the nation. Now, these bands in Seattle, when they got together to start bands, they didn't get together to start grunge bands. They were starting garage bands. They were starting punk rock bands. And it was the media and the journalists that said, you know what? This is grunge. So in comes oversized and tattered clothes, all right? You're talking about flannels. You're talking about denims with holes all over the place. Oh, you got a plaid shirt on? No big deal. Tie another plaid shirt around your waist. There's no such thing as too much plaid. Oh, you haven't been to the barber in like 5 years? That's even better. The more it looked like you just rolled out of bed and just walked off into the world, the more you were celebrated as a human being. And I love that. I gotta say that that might be the most punk rock that the world has ever been. And we're kind of coming back around to this again these days in more of like a post-grunge kind of way. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're not there yet. Just as fast as grunge came, grunge went again. And I'm not going to talk about any of the tragic moments that might have went into that, but in walks pop punk, all right? Now they're spiking their hair. They might be putting sweatbands on their arms. They might have oversized dickies and pulled up their socks all the way. They have these big, chunky ass skateboarding shoes. Maybe a big old necklace. This pop punk look, when juxtaposed with grunge, really looks like these guys were trying so hard. They spent so much money on like hair gel and products and hair dye, all right? They're always like shaving their little goatees into funny little shapes, that kind of thing. And I'm so glad that that stuff died out as we moved into the 2000s. And as we moved into those 2000s, things got mad interesting yet again. Now we gotta talk about post-hardcore. Bands like Attack Attack and that whole MySpace type aesthetic would all kind of melt and congeal together with what we now know as the emo look, with the black eyeliner, the swoopy black hair, and that kind of thing. And as that style of emo was kind of dominating the mainstream perception of what emo was, there was also another kind of emo just below that, and that was a little bit more of a Midwestern type emo thing. They were still trying to sing sad songs to make girls swoon, but this flavor of emo had a little bit more of like an indie pop type vibe to it. Seems more like it came from like the pop punk world, whereas this other emo that I'm talking about definitely came from the post-hardcore world. And then of course all of this stuff would melt together and you wouldn't be able to tell what was what anymore. You'd see a band like Escape the Fate and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a band like The Used. And then Black Veil Brides, Pierce the Veil. It was like, oh my god, I am going so crazy with all this stuff that is going on right now. I can't even tell one thing from the next. But it was a band called 18 Visions that would take it to the extreme, all right? Everybody was denouncing fashion. Nuh-uh, no more. 18 Visions were embracing fashion, all right? They were wearing three-piece suits. They were doing their hair in all funny ways, wearing lots of makeup. So they were combining all of these post-hardcore emo elements, but doing it in a very, very fashion-forward way. And as they were doing it, they were being ridiculed for doing it. And this stuff really did come before all the stuff that I was just talking about. 18 Visions was kind of the godfather of that. Made people realize, oh my god, I can embrace black nail polish, I can embrace all this stuff and still be in a really heavy band. Okay, so people started to do that a little bit more. 18 Visions were not making like mainstream accessible music, but when bands like The Used would start to make more accessible music in this kind of style, it would inspire bands like My Chemical Romance to really explode. And then we get to the 2010s and punk rock is kind of fallen off a whole bunch, you know. We got a whole bunch of hip hop and trap music kind of dominating everywhere. But this is where we start to see that MySpace aesthetic start to come back in the form of e-girls and e-boys. And that mumble rap trap SoundCloud stuff that I was just talking about would morph itself into more of like an emo rap type thing, like with artists XXXTentacion and Lil Peep. These two dudes in the 2010s were about as punk rock as you could possibly be, bringing in peak face tattoo era. And now here we are in the 2020s and it's just a big melting pot of everything. If you go to an emo show, people are looking like emos. If you go to a pop punk show, people are looking like pop punkers, all right? But generally, we seem to be kind of settling on this anti-style thing that was kind of going around in the 80s, where we're just showing up in our hoodies, and that's the choice that's being made aesthetically. And personally, I think that's the best one. But looking forward to the future of punk fashion, I really want to see cybernetics take hold, all right? Cybernetic implants. We need a cyberpunk future. I'm just kidding. Cyberpunk is a dystopia, and I don't think that that is a great idea. That means embracing all the scary AI stuff, and I'm not ready for that yet. All right, that's been Punk Fashion. I've been Dan Frampton. Thank you so much for watching. Down there in the comments, I want you to let me know what you're dressing like these days and what you're listening to. And until my next upload, you can watch one of these other uploads. Okay, see you later.